I'm Allison. This is my second vlog about Anna Marie Gigosi's Queer Theory, an Introduction, and Paris is Burning. Let's start off with Queer Theory. I thought it was a pretty alright book. It was like, an introduction to queer theory that really mapped out a cultural, political history in scholarship and academia of how we have come to define or conceptualize what queer is and how queer changes over time, since that is a very big part of this. But very straightforward book. I really like it. Maybe not the first book you should read if you're like starting in queer scholarship or queer studies, but it's pretty good. Definitely an audience that is targeted towards someone that has some idea of queer history. There's definitions given, but in a very embedded in a very political, cultural history, and not necessarily in something that is a concise or cohesive definition, which is kind of the point, because queer cannot be defined in a cohesive, always a cohesive like definition or coherent definition. So I guess that's kind of the point, but there are other facets to that may need to be defined beforehand to fully understand what the author was trying to get across. But my favorite thing I think I'm going to take away from this book, even though I don't know if this is like what was necessarily being asked for, were Molly houses or clubs, I think, in the 1920s being held by gay men, or not 1920s, like 1800s I think it was. But that was nice, just like not necessarily a place that men went to have sex, but definitely the beginnings of a culture at the end of the 19th century, so yes, in the 1800s. But definitely just sounded like a nice little kiki, but the formations of a culture and an identity, not necessarily a behavior, which I think is a very important concept in this book as well. So that's what I learned, and I'm going to take away from this book, as well as some things on lesbian feminism and how that kind of played out, and sometimes how it was very contradictory to itself, which makes sense, but also was fascinating just to read about in full. So my first quote that I'm going to read is on page 77 and 78, the last paragraph into the beginning of 78. But queer, on the other hand, exemplifies a more mediated relation to categories of identification. Access to the post-structuralist theorization of identity as provisional and contingent, coupled with the growing awareness of the limitations of identity, categories, and items of political representation, enabled queer to emerge as a new form of personal identification and political organization. Identity is probably one of the most naturalized cultural categories each of us inhabits. One always thinks of oneself as existing outside of representational frames, and as somehow making a point of undeniable realness. So that was kind of long and I kind of messed up, but the gist is that queer I may exist out of identity, but identity is still a very key process to shaping what queer is, or how we identify with queer. So I very much related to that quote, and just the fact that identity, while we think it's something, while we define ourselves within different identities and we think it's like very, not always special to us, but it's undeniable realness, and that we relate to it outside of anything else. Or I'm trying to explain this in a way that makes sense, but it's just it's hard because it makes sense to me, but identity isn't just something that's fake, even though it definitely exists in social, cultural, political structures and institutions, we take it as something that is existing outside of that, even though it's not. Cat. I'm sorry, I'm just gonna move past that. But that was my first quote. I hope that got across. My second quote is on page 126. Queer's impact on identity politics is yet to be determined. It is probable that identity politics will not disappear under the influence of queer, but become more nuanced, less sure of itself, and more attuned to the multiple compromises and pragmatic effects that characterize any mobilization of identity. So, even though queer isn't like a stable or very not concise identity or at times culture, it does impede what we feel, how we as a society characterize and identify identities, if that makes sense. Just that it's not going, like right now we're seeing that gender is not just a binary, or race isn't just a binary. Queer is definitely playing a big part as we deconstruct those binaries and move on to something that is not necessarily outside of identity politics, since we still go by those labels and make up new labels, but we're definitely not existing within the same boundaries that we used to in queer, and the existence and the development and evolution of queer has to do with that. So I think that's very important, especially when as we start on this course and on this journey, how queer has disrupted those boundaries and different aspects of society and culture and socio-economic identities itself. So there is that. I guess that can conclude this portion, and let's talk about the next portion, which is probably my favorite because I love Paris is Burning. I've probably seen this movie like 11 times in my undergraduate career thus far, but I loved watching it again for this, so no sweat off my back. But Paris is Burning makes me feel a lot of things when I watch it, just because one, I always get a little upset about the directors and the people that filmed this movie made a lot of money off of this movie while only giving $10,000 to the entire cast. But beyond that, it's a great film as it explores, one, identity politics. That's something that I thought was very relatable to queer theory, and I even just want to read a quote that I thought of when I watched this at 2 o'clock in the morning when I was working after I had read it, and it's on page 86, and it's about Judith Butler's conceptualization of performance and performativity in identity and culture, and what she says about drag as a source of performance, or not a source, but a type of performance. So rather than literal staginess, it offers an effective cultural model for deconstructing those commonly held assumptions that privilege certain genders and sexualities by attributing naturalness and originality to them. Paris is Burning is a lot about making a very real identity to these people in spaces that do accept them and they are safe in, because in the real world, in the actual real world, these identities aren't being accepted, especially at the time that it was filmed in the 1980s, when gay is being criminalized and characterized by AIDS, the AIDS epidemic. But to them, this isn't just a performance, it's not just drag, this is the transformation of identity and how we form communities, and especially as a queer and minority race, mainly black and Latino community, how they make a real life for them in a world that is denying them and disenfranchising them. So I just thought about that, and that's something I always think about, how community and family is such a big part to this community, and pretty much in every community in the LGBT community, as it has come to be in like the point that we stand here now, because it hasn't always been as open, if you might say, right now, as we all know. But those communities help they definitely influence how we identify and how queer is applied in those communities, as we also saw in the book, and how queer at one point was used as a source, a term to identify oneself, and then became very much demonized and out of the picture in exchange for gay and lesbian. What else about this movie? Just Venus Extravaganza. I always cry when I watch this, just because even though I know, and it's just, even though it's the sad reality, that doesn't make it okay, and this is still the reality for many trans women, and even though it's not a very poignant part of this movie. I don't even think they say trans once in Paris is Burning, but that's definitely the emergence of trans pride and it's rooted in this drag community of drag houses for Black and Latino LGBT youth. So just to reflect on that and how our current situation for Black and Latino trans youth and just trans people in general is playing out right now. One thing about like a visual aspect that I didn't really think about until I was asked this question was how dark the movie kind of is, especially when it's in the drag houses or when the interviews are being done. They're in very dark settings or without natural light, and that's definitely, I think, not only symbolic, but the real truth that they had to hide away. They had to be in dark spaces because these identities aren't safe in the light of day. They aren't given the light of day, so these are communities that are being done from the ground up in spaces that they must make for themselves outside of the light. And I also just love the interviews. They're very personal, being done in Dorian's dressing room and I think Princess LaBeija, her house. Very personal and very informal. I like the entire documentary style. It's not a very it's structured, but I don't. That's what I will say about that. I guess it's there and it flows very well to get the point across. But definitely that light and dark balance is something that I think is more to think about in regards to the movie. And again, I think this is more than 5 minutes, so I'm gonna stop, but I really love this movie. Great movie. Great people.